unabashed,
the most unpredictable,
becomes a headline,
the most volatile,
outrageous behavior,
unsubstantiated narratives,
a battle of personalities.
Welcome to Grand Tamasha. I'm your host, Milan of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. We had not planned to discuss foreign policy on the show today, but in light of recent events in the region, it's impossible to ignore the recent tensions between India and Pakistan, so we're going to lean right into it. For some insight into the conflict and its implications for Indian political scenario, I'm joined today by Rizal Hassan Laskar, the foreign editor of the Hindustan Times, and Alyssa Ayres, senior fellow for India, Pakistan, and South Asia at the Council on Foreign Relations here in D.C. Rizal and Alyssa, thanks for joining us on the podcast today.
Thank you. Happy to join.
So I think we're all recovering from last week's frenzy of activity along the India-Pakistan border. We saw an Indian airstrike on Jaish-e-Mohammed training camps across the line of control. Pakistan struck back with an aerial bombing in Jammu and Kashmir. An Indian Air Force pilot was shot down in Pakistani territory and handed back to India on Friday after a brief detention. Over the weekend, we saw heavy artillery shelling on both sides of the border. Rizal, let me start with you. Now that major combat hostilities have ended, at least for now, what is the government in India saying about what it accomplished with last week's strikes?
Well, the combat activities have ended, but there's been a lot of developments today on both sides of the border. Pakistan has launched some sort of a crackdown on banned groups, and we're hearing that 44 people have been detained, including two very senior leaders of the Jaish-e-Mohammed. On the Indian side, the Indian officials are saying in private conversations that, the main objective of the airstrike was to send out a message to Pakistan that India has the intent and the capability to target terrorist training camps and facilities. But at the same time, they're saying that, it's a little too early to say whether Pakistan is doing enough to crack down on terror groups, especially the banned groups like Jaish-e-Mohammed and Lashkar-e-Toiba. And they intend to continue working with the world community to mount pressure on Pakistan to, deliver on its counterterrorism commitments.
So, Alyssa, let's bring this you into the conversation. I mean, we have seen this movie before.
Many times.
Incident happens, Pakistan cracks down, people are placed under house arrest, and then lo and behold, weeks, months, years later, they reappear, another attack. How serious do you think this crackdown is, and what are the signs that we're really looking for?
First of all, it's a great step. So we commend the step of the crackdown. But I think having seen this movie so many times, we're on, version 10.0 at this point, really we'll only know how serious this crackdown is several months down the line. And I think that's why it's important for American diplomacy in particular to also keep up the pressure through the variety of different lanes of effort, whether it's through international financial consultation to try to create a context where Pakistan no longer allows its financial networks to be used to supply funding to these groups. Remember, the groups that are now undergoing a crackdown have been nominally banned since January 2002. So that just highlights the fact that there's been very little done to constrain the activities, the planning, the plotting, the growth of these groups within Pakistan, despite all Pakistani commitments to the contrary in their dialogue with the United States, in their dialogue with the international community. So I think that's actually going to be something to watch, and it means that nobody can let up on the diplomacy.
So let me just stick with the diplomacy for a second. A lot of analysts have been surprised at the extent to which the United States and the State Department have been sort of in the background. In previous crises, they've been a bit more forward. We've seen shuttle diplomacy. We've seen a kind of frenetic pace of activity. Do you think, Alyssa, that the U.S. response has been different? And if so, what do you ascribe that to?
I think right after the Pulwama attack, we saw a relatively muted U.S. response. And by that, I mean that the vehicles for U.S. proclamations on what had taken place with the terrorist attack took the form of a fairly strong statement from the State Department, one from the White House attributed to the press secretary, then a tweet from the Secretary of State, Secretary Pompeo, but the tweet didn't refer to any kind of phone communications with counterparts in the region. And then there was a tweet from the National Security Advisor, Ambassador Bolton, which did refer to a phone call he had clearly taken with India's National Security Advisor. So you saw what seemed to be one line of communication between U.S. senior officials and the region in the person of Ambassador Bolton and NSA Doval in India. But you didn't see evidence of anything else. So we didn't see shuttle diplomacy. We didn't see other levels of U.S. government senior officials reaching out to counterparts. If there was that kind of communication, it certainly wasn't being briefed out to the press. What we saw then last week stepped things up. That was where I think we saw a little bit more of a public demonstration that the United States was becoming more involved. The president's surprise statement during Hanoi that the United States was working hard to try to bring things down. There was U.S. engagement in the UN Security Council, which released a press statement condemning the Pulwama attack on the 22nd of February. It was clear that Secretary Pompeo had made phone calls this past week to counterparts in India and in Pakistan because that was briefed out. So we did see a kind of escalation of U.S. engagement, but I do think we didn't see that in the first week, and I found that a little bit surprising.
So, Rizal, let's go from the international to the domestic here. I mean, the opposition in India is raising questions about the efficacy of the Indian Air Force strike. They're pointing to evidence that seems to suggest the strikes may not have been as impactful as the government claims. You know, how is the opposition trying to balance, on the one hand, questioning the government, but without, on the other hand, appearing to criticize the armed forces? And can it really succeed in doing so?
Well, the opposition, especially the Congress, is having a really tough one on this in this particular aspect. They have, raised very pointed questions about, some of the casualty figures that have been mentioned by government officials. We've had BJP leaders and some ministers talking about, up to 300 terrorists being killed. And clearly, there's no evidence on the ground to back that up. There have been no technical evidence that has been shared with either the media or with lawmakers. So there are a lot of questions, but, the BJP is sort of trying to portray this as, anyone questioning the armed forces is not being very patriotic. But I think, the armed forces themselves have been very, very professional. They have said that their main intention was to send out a message that India has the capability to target terrorist facilities across the border, and that is the most important part of their messaging.
So Rizal, what are the next steps, right? I mean, Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan's decision to return the captured Indian Air Force pilot in relatively short order seems to have given both countries an off-ramp to de-escalate the conflict. Are both sides taking that off-ramp, and what are the sort of next diplomatic and or strategic steps that you expect India to take?
Well, there has definitely been a significant reduction in tensions. Just today, it's been announced that Pakistan's High Commissioner to India is going to return. He had been called back for consultations, a long time ago. The Pakistani Foreign Office has also said that it is committed to contacts between the Directors General of Military Operations. So clearly, there are some steps being taken to de-escalate. But, in private conversations with Indian officials, one gets the feeling that there is very little appetite to kind of roll back the pressure on counterterrorism initiatives. Indian officials are still talking about, using the FATF to mount pressure on Pakistan over terror financing. They're, talking about, more steps. As Alyssa mentioned, it's been there, done that about these crackdowns. They want to see concrete actions, possibly prosecution of the people who have been detained. So I think the Indian officials are still not really satisfied with the actions being taken by Pakistan, and they are going to talk to the world community to kind of keep up the pressure on Islamabad.
So I want to end our news roundup by asking each of you to share with our listeners, one story coming out of India this week that you think has not been adequately reported, but that we need to pay attention to. Alyssa, let me start with you. What is it that we need to know that we're not hearing enough about?
Well, I think all stories coming out of India should actually get much greater visibility in the United States. It's something I've been saying for some time. I think the escalation of tensions between India and Pakistan put India and South Asia much more on the American news radar screen. But to be honest, in fact, this very important and quite dangerous escalation last week was overshadowed by what? By the testimony on Capitol Hill of President Trump's former personal lawyer, Michael Cohen. It was also overshadowed by the president's summit in Hanoi with Kim Jong-un. So even for something that could have led to catastrophic consequences in South Asia, even that what on a quote-unquote normal news cycle would have been very top news headline, it actually was quite below what you would expect to see. It's very hard to get India and South Asia on the radar screen, and so I think that everybody has a responsibility to be paying much closer attention. Brexit gets daily coverage in a way that India and South Asia do not.
Rizal, what about you? What should we be listening to that we're not?
Well, for me, one of the most interesting things was India attending the meeting of the foreign ministers of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation in Abu Dhabi as a guest of honor. And this coincided with, certain efforts by the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi and also the Saudis to kind of help in de-escalating the tensions. I mean, this is something that has not been reported very much outside India. And even in India, it was reported very fleetingly, the mediation by the UAE and Saudi Arabia. And this is very, very interesting because India decided to attend the OIC meeting in Abu Dhabi despite knowing that, there would be some resolutions on Kashmir being passed. And, if you really look back, India was invited to the first meetings in almost 50 years ago that led to the OIC being formed. But they were kept out because of the lobbying by Pakistan. So a lot of people are looking at this as a very interesting development, because India with 190 million Muslims, certain officials feel definitely qualifies for observer status, at least with OIC.
So my vote for underreported story is not so much an underreported story as it is a late breaking story. Yesterday evening, Washington time, we learned that the United States was going to withdraw GSP preferences for India. These are the preferences under which billions of dollars in Indian exports enter the United States without tariff duty. This is, I think, a pretty significant escalation in terms of the bilateral economic grievances that the two countries have been talking about. A lot of people thought that this possible revocation was a kind of diplomatic ploy, but it turns out the Trump administration is quite serious, and I think we're going to see the fallout of this play out over the next couple of weeks. Alyssa, who do you think had the best week in India?
Weirdly, Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan. For people who have been watching this crisis unfold, there were suddenly reports of the statesman-like comportment of Imran Khan, for the fast return of India's downed pilot, and for his offer of resuming some kind of dialogue, including a willingness to resume dialogue on the topic of terrorism. This is somebody who at one time was referred to as Taliban Khan. So to see that kind of shift in perception so quickly, I thought was quite interesting.
Rizal, who do you think had the best week in India?
Well, I have to agree with Alyssa. I mean, I've lived and worked in Pakistan. I've seen Imran Khan, the rise in the last few years. I think he had a pretty solid week, but with one caveat. The Pakistani military issued a very ham-handed sort of a video on the pilot who was returned. And that, I think, cut into some of the goodwill that Mr. Khan had earned among Indians. But otherwise, I mean, he had a pretty decent week.
So I think the person who had the best week in India is Amit Shah. Amit Shah has been struggling to create a narrative for the BJP's 2019 election campaign. I still think that issues of the economy and employment and welfare are going to matter, but I think we now have foreign policy, national security, terrorism entering mass politics in a way that it normally does not. And this is ground, I think, that favors the BJP over the opposition and will result in potentially bringing some swing voters over to the BJP side, or people who had maybe doubts about voting again for the BJP. Their minds might be changed. Alyssa, who had the worst week?
So can I choose not an individual, but come on.
Absolutely.
All right.
Yeah, no
okay.
rules.
I thought you
Whatever
were shaking
want.
your head. I'd like to say Indian economic news. This was actually not a good week at all for economic news. It turns out that the growth figures are 6.6%. That was not what people hoped to be able to point to, certainly in the run up to the elections. We do not see any good news anywhere on the horizon on employment issues. Now with the GSP revocation, you've got a kind of escalating tension. The U.S.-India economic and trade dialogue is already very tense, as we know, but it becomes even more tense on an issue that has been previewed for some time, but we didn't know that it was going to come down last night. So I think this was a pretty tough week if you're following Indian economic news.
Rizal, who had a bad week in India this past week?
Well, I'm going to take Alyssa's lead, and I'm not going to say a particular individual, but I think, I'd say that Indian journalists had a pretty bad week, especially because of all the confusion and the conflicting reports that were going around about, what exactly happened between India and Pakistan. It was a pretty tough time to kind of sift through all the information that was coming in and to decide what was believable and what was clearly, exaggeration. And all in all, I don't think too many of us had a very great week.
Rizal, Alyssa, thank you for joining me on the Grand Tamasha podcast. After a quick break, I'll be back to talk with political scientist Vipin Narang on when foreign policy actually matters for domestic politics in India. My guest on the podcast today is Vipin Narang. Vipin is an associate professor of political science at MIT and a member of MIT's Security Studies program, and he's also a non-resident scholar here at the Carnegie Endowment. Vipin is one of the most insightful analysts of Indian foreign policy, nuclear weapons, international security, and he's thought deeply about the intersection of domestic and foreign policy in India, which is especially relevant in the wake of the current tensions between India and Pakistan. Vipin's graciously taken the time to talk to us today, even though he's in Abu Dhabi for work. Vipin, thanks for joining us on the podcast.
Hey, thanks, Milan. It's great to be on here with you, and thanks for that way too kind introduction.
So there's a lot of speculation right now about what the ongoing tensions with Pakistan mean for the Indian general election. We're just weeks away from the start of the election. Now, this is not a subject on which there's extensive polling, a lot of survey data, but you've written a fascinating article last year with Paul Stanley, and we'll link to that on our show page, that takes a fresh look at the domestic implications of foreign policy in India. So let's start with what the conventional wisdom is, which is that foreign policy doesn't really matter for domestic politics. Why has this become, in your view, the consensus view?
I think, the view in India is that, or the view in political science generally, is that foreign policy tends not to be a high priority voting issue. And in India especially, you have the bulk of the population is rural, it's poor, it has, lack of information. And issues like, the relationship with the United States, Russia, Japan, China aren't necessarily high salient, high information issues that voters vote on. They're more interested in onion prices, salaries, and, the general state of their local economy, village level issues. In urban India, the economy tends to be the primary issue on which voters tend to focus on, and foreign policy is never generally believed to be a high priority issue, and it's not something that Indian politicians have focused a lot on over the years. And what Paul and I argue is that there's variation in when foreign policy matters and how it can matter. In India, especially with a parliamentary system, there's often problem. If you were an Indian voter that you cared about foreign policy, the problem is how do you even punish a prime minister in a parliamentary system or reward a prime minister for good foreign policy behavior? Because if you're in a constituency in Tamil Nadu, you're voting for usually AIDMK or DMK, not necessarily a major national party. And so, the alliances are sometimes announced in advance, but sometimes it's very difficult for voters to hold prime ministers responsible for anything, let alone foreign policy. And the other big issue is that foreign policy there's variation in salience. And what we found looking at polling data over many years is that most foreign policy issues don't matter all that much to Indians, with one major exception, Pakistan. And so, this crisis, in the 6 weeks or so before we have the election. If it continues and, Prime Minister Modi makes it salient, prime ministers have and politicians have the ability to manipulate salience as well. If they make it an election or campaign issue, then it's possible that voters may incorporate their views of his performance on this crisis in their decisions in their in a constituency where a BJP candidate may be running. It'd be very difficult, I think, in areas where regional parties are primarily on the ballot and the BJP or Congress is not represented. But we find this variation, and the easier it is to hold a prime minister responsible. Now Modi owns this because he's clearly the man in charge. He has an outright majority in parliament. And so in this particular case, it's possible that voters judge him on his performance with the general election coming up so soon. But, there's also empirical evidence against that. In the Kargil War in 1999, the BJP had actually, lost a vote of confidence. And during the war, general elections were several months after the Kargil War, and the AIA-DMK had pulled out, pretty much right before the war. And it's not clear that voters really cared about the fact that the BJP and Prime Minister Vajpayee did a pretty good job in handling the Kargil War. And likewise, in the 2008 Mumbai attacks, which were in November 2008, Congress and the UPA were facing a re-election campaign just 6 months later. They decided to exercise strategic restraint, but it's not clear that in May 2009, voters, judged Congress or the UPA based on its performance of even that attack. And that was a spectacular attack on a major Indian city. So it may be the case that in India, foreign policy whips up the media and people care now, but in 6 weeks from now, it'll be unclear as to how they judge the prime minister.
You and Paul in your paper talk about sort of two dimensions of foreign policy issues, right? So one is clarity of responsibility. To what extent can the voter really attribute credit or blame, right, to a national leader like Prime Minister Modi? And then the second is sort of salience. An issue with Pakistan, a conflict with Pakistan is maybe different than a skirmish with China or some trade tension with the United States. So it seems to me, just going on that, in this case, you have clarity of responsibility. That's pretty high, right? Prime Minister Modi has a single-party majority government. Everyone knows he's the guy in charge. He has used his bully pulpit to make that very clear. And Pakistan is a highly emotive issue on both sides of the border, but certainly in India ahead of a general election. So if there were an example of an issue that would take center stage.
This should. I mean, we should see Modi trying to take credit for his response. And we're already seeing it in the days after. He has an incentive because Pakistan is such a salient foreign policy issue. You're absolutely right. Our prediction would be that this shows up in campaigns. He tries to raise the salience. He tries to take credit for it. And likewise, actually, the Congress Party, we would also predict that the Congress Party is seizing on the Rafale acquisition because, again, there was clarity of responsibility. And the salience of Rafale is not about foreign policy, but corruption in defense acquisition. And that's something we identify. Voters don't care about a lot when it comes to defense acquisition, but they care about corruption. And this is an issue that Congress has seized on in order to try to pin it on Modi because it was very directly his choice to short-circuit the acquisition process and go to a government-to-government deal with France. And so on both sides, you're seeing, a defense acquisition issue that Congress has been, trying to whip up over the last several months. And Modi, I suspect, he has every incentive to try to continue to raise the profile of his performance in this crisis, which he'll say, we degraded Jaish-e-Mohammed. I did something that, no prime minister has done in almost 50 years, and I hit Pakistan where it hurt with interest. I mean, you're already seeing that language coming out. It's hard to parse out whether voters will be responsive to it and whether they vote for him because of this. But it's certainly something he will try to leverage, and we're seeing it already in the campaign.
And you raise an interesting point with the Rafale deal. I mean, Congress should know about corruption and defense acquisition more than anyone because it was on the receiving end back when Rajiv Gandhi was prime minister with the scandal of the Bofors, where they did feel the electoral pinch.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think, they're trying to run the reverse playbook on Prime Minister Modi. And, it's unclear, again, how much traction it's gotten. But, the government seems to not be able to, BJP can't get out of it. It keeps coming up, in the Supreme Court and the CAG report. And, Congress believes it's found an issue that it can at least raise questions about, and they know that voters care about corruption. And the media is, I think, also, playing watchdog on this and raising the questions about, well, did the process, was the process adhered to? Is there, did India overpay for the Rafales? And so it has lingered a lot longer than I think the BJP wants. And, I think Congress is delighted having, suffered from a similar tactic over the Bofors case to be able to try to do it to the BJP now.
So I want to come back to the conventional wisdom about foreign policy. The political scientist Ashutosh Varshney, famously has argued that, in politics around the world, and especially in India, you have sort of mass issues and you have elite issues. And foreign policy is, by and large, an elite issue, as you said. So it's not really that relevant. In a new piece that he published this week, and we'll link to this, Varshney says that this could be changing, and he has three reasons why he thinks foreign policy might matter more in 2019. So one is, the size of India's middle class is growing. There's greater media consumption. The timing of the clash is important, like literally just as we're probably just, days, weeks away from the Election Commission announcing the dates of the election. And the nature of the regime in Delhi, this being not just a single-party majority, but a nationalist government that has tried to profit off of its kind of hawkishness. So do you agree that the landscape is shifting to such an extent that we're kind of in different territory today than, say, we were back in 1999 after the Kargil War?
Absolutely. All those trends are true, but there's one there's one additional fuel on the fire that I think has really whipped up most Indians now who, and the middle class is part of this. They have access to cell phones. They have access to Twitter. They have access to 24/7 news media. And the social media and the media environment in India has whipped up a frenzy over this issue, which has been literally kerosene on the fire. I mean, I think they've just, inflamed passions about it. And so what used to be low information voters who didn't have access to this information, or all the Twitterati and the breaking news, and then, television and 24/7 news channels, they now have access to it. So all of these combine to create, more information, but not necessarily better information voters. And, I think this is kind of the dynamic where it can be, especially on this issue of Pakistan and terrorism in India and in the homeland against security forces. It is a really emotional issue, I think, even for, rural Indians who in the Kargil War probably had no idea, what the ground situation was. But now, because of the new media environment, in the past 20 years, we've seen just a rapid increase in the dissemination of information in these new tools over the internet and the television. And so you can activate this kind of nationalism and salience in the voters. So I think it is different, and this will be an interesting test, even compared to 2008. I think some of us were speculating, if you had Twitter during the Kargil War, they may have ended up in nuclear war on both sides, because the pressure for escalation, given, the day-to-day exchanges of fire and, casualties on both sides, if you had inflamed entire nations with the internet, Twitter, and television, it could have been a totally different outcome. And I think, it's very dangerous to add an expansion. Nationalism is a very, very, potent force, and has to be harnessed and controlled also. Unleashed, it can, be very, very dangerous. And I think we're at an inflection point where, I think what we saw on both sides in India and Pakistan was a real inflaming of national emotions nationwide, hundreds of millions of people. And that can be very, very dangerous.
So I think the consensus among op-ed writers, columnists, India watchers is that, net, this conflict works in Modi's favor politically because it plays to some of his strengths, right? It plays to his claim of strong leadership. It plays to his supposed decisiveness. It plays to the BJP's nationalism. Is there a scenario that you could foresee that this actually backfires. So, the opposition is saying the military has claimed that they have damaged or destroyed these terrorist training camps in Pakistan, that they've killed scores of terrorists. But the satellite imagery seems to suggest that the only thing that's died is, a bunch of trees in the forest, right?
Yep.
So is there a way in which this could actually make Modi appear quite weak rather than strong?
So I think that's a very good question, and I think this is where the difference between the mass activation of foreign policy and the elite activation will be different. I think at this point, most voters are probably going to take away the Modi narrative that he hit back, and he got the pilot back also, right? The details about the bomb damage assessment are interesting to maybe 100 people. And there's enough ambiguity there that Prime Minister Modi can say that these are Western reports. These are people who are trying to, mollify Pakistan or whatever. So there's enough ambiguity as to what India may or may not have hit. And I'm not in a position at this point. I've seen the satellite imagery. I have doubts, but I'm also not willing to say that it's conclusive yet. And we need to wait for an official assessment, both from India and whatever outside sources there may be. But there's enough ambiguity that I think it's best to leave ambiguous at this point, because Pakistan can say India didn't hit anything. Prime Minister Modi can say they degraded Jaish-e-Mohammed. And if it becomes conclusive that India hit nothing, the fear is then that Modi will be tempted to hit back even harder next time. And from a strategic stability perspective, that may not be in India's strategic interest. I think right now, though, the narrative, I'm sure the opposition will seize on this to criticize Modi's handling of the situation. But most voters will probably take away, I think, that Modi hit back into Pakistan in a way that a prime minister hadn't before. He showed strength and decisiveness, as you said. And the details about the actual bomb damage assessment are so detailed that becomes an elite issue. And so I think this distinction will probably end up favoring Modi's narrative. Whether people actually vote on it is a separate issue, but at least for the narrative purposes for the election, he has a bully pulpit where he can keep saying, I hit hard, I hit decisive, we'll pay back with interest. And, he activates this really, atavistic nationalism in, the bulk of Indian voters. And I think that'll he'll probably play to that in the electoral campaign, and people will probably be receptive to it.
And it's difficult for the opposition to criticize the government without appearing to criticize the armed forces, or at least be accused of doing
right.
so,
and
right?
He's already started doing that, right? You see, if you criticize the action, you're criticizing the armed forces, and you're helping Pakistan, right? So he's playing the anti-national card already. It makes it very difficult for the opposition. You're absolutely right.
So one final question on Pakistan itself and its relation to India. A lot of people are speculating that this crisis, we may have hit a sort of pause, right, in major hostilities, but it's going to get a lot worse before it gets better, because the structural issues fundamentally are unchanged. That is,
support for terrorism
in Pakistan, the potency of militant groups, their ability to come into Indian territory undetected, and a nationalist government which, even if it doesn't come back with a single-party majority, I think odds are that it will come back to power. Do you agree with this, that things are going to get worse before they get better?
Yeah, but I think there's an additional piece of this story that is getting lost, because Jaish-e-Mohammed made Indian attribution very easy because they took credit the day of the attack. So one question is, you have to ask why they did that, because otherwise we'd be litigating what nobody is really talking about has been lost, is that the perpetrator of the attack was a local Kashmiri boy. Dar was an Indian citizen, and he was radicalized by the Jaish-e-Mohammed. But you have to ask, and India needs to ask, how it let its own population be susceptible to such radicalization that he was willing to drive a minivan full of RDX into a bus of CRPF soldiers and personnel. Because that's the story that's being lost here. It's the failing of governance that Delhi's had in Kashmir. A political solution to Kashmir is still elusive after how many years? And it's true that Jaish-e-Mohammed took advantage of the susceptibility of these boys. And that'll continue. But there is a real domestic political problem that India has to confront. And on the Jaish-e-Mohammed side, why did they take credit? Why would you make it so easy for the Indians to blame Pakistan for this? Because it may have been hard for India to establish a conclusive link between Dar and the Jaish-e-Mohammed absent that attribution and claim taking claim the day of the attack. I mean, one theory is actually that Pakistan's militants the militant groups, the LET, Jaish-e-Mohammed, are trying to outbid each other. And that does not portend well, because now the LET has to show it can strike India in the heartland, and Jaish-e-Mohammed will have to do the same, because they're facing recruitment problems. Each one is trying to be the ISI's, golden militant group. And, that dynamic is very dangerous for India. And throw on top of that, a disaffected youth population in Kashmir, and you have a recipe for a real long-term problem in India. And, part of the solution is, well, there needs to be a political solution in Kashmir also, first and foremost. And, Pakistan obviously has to crack down on the militant groups, but the problem with these militant groups is that they're given enough capability and enough plausible deniability that then they can take on an agenda and a life of their own. And Pakistan may have trouble controlling some of these groups.
Vipin, I want to thank you again for joining us. I know that this has been an incredibly hectic week for you, but we're really grateful for your insights.
No, thanks for having me. It was a real pleasure, and I'm glad we could do this.
Thanks for doing it. Grant Tamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. You can find us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review. It helps others find the show more easily. For more information about the show and to find the writing we reference on this week's episode, visit our website, granttamasha.com. Production assistance comes from Jamie Hinson and Rachel Osnos. Tim Martin's our audio engineer, and Lauren Duax our executive producer. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.